In late 377 AD, according to the soldier historian Ammianus Marcellinus, a Roman general named Auxiliaries heard the thunder of 40,000 Gothic warriors descending on his position. His men were digging trenches, not fighting. Digging. Entrenching tools in hand, armor half removed, formations scattered across an unfinished camp perimeter. Before him stood a horde that had shattered every Roman force it encountered. Behind him, the Black Sea. No retreat, no reinforcements, no time. Think about that moment, caught between picks and spades. Enemy cavalry already visible on the horizon. Dust clouds rising like the end of the world. Your men exhausted from a forced march. Half your defensive works incomplete. The most mobile, lethal warriors in Europe bearing down at full gallop. By the end of this video, you'll understand how Ammianus Marcellinus's brutally honest account reveals why elite Roman discipline could delay the inevitable, but not prevent it. I'm about to reveal 3 documented facts that define the twilight of Roman military supremacy. First, the shield wall formation executed by the Cornutai Auxiliaries under conditions historians call tactically impossible. Second, why a trumpet blast documented in the primary source transformed chaos into the most disciplined suicidal charge in ancient warfare. Third, the cavalry envelopment that destroyed 500 of Rome's finest shock troops in a killing pocket they couldn't escape. But here's what makes this historically devastating. How did infantry armed with javelins and swords hold back 40,000 warriors long enough to be remembered 15 centuries later? Why did a Roman general order an attack when every tactical principle demanded retreat? How did Germanic auxiliaries fighting for Rome execute Roman discipline better than Romans themselves? And why does Ammianus provide combat details so visceral that modern historians can reconstruct the exact moment discipline transformed into slaughter? To understand how the last great Roman infantry made their stand, we need to step back to 376 AD, when an entire nation appeared on the Danube frontier with desperate eyes and empty hands. Battles were not about glory. They were about decisions made in seconds that killed thousands. Victory was never guaranteed by numbers alone. It was earned moment by moment, shield by shield, until exhaustion or mathematics finally decided. We remember who won empires. We forget who held the line when empires were already lost. By the end of this video, you'll understand how a Roman force surprised while pitching camp transformed certain massacre into desperate resistance. Why their commander's decision to attack rather than flee represented the only mathematically viable option for survival. What the Brilliance war cry sounded like when 500 men knew they were already dead. You'll see the tactical geometry that briefly held back a horde. The moment cavalry envelopment turned resistance into annihilation. And the exact sequence of collapse that made Debaltum a forgotten footnote while Adrianople became famous. You'll discover why the Cornutai Auxiliaries, Germanic warriors fighting for Rome, executed shield wall discipline that pure Roman legions had already abandoned. How throwing weapons created temporary superiority before swords ever clashed. And why the historical record preserves this massacre in clinical detail while ignoring the names of the 500 who died. These weren't battles about changing history. They were battles about delaying collapse long enough for someone, somewhere, to notice that Rome was bleeding to death on 100 forgotten fields. This was not about strength. It was about discipline, holding against impossible odds until mathematics caught up. One decision, one trumpet blast. 500 men who bought the empire hours it would waste. Hit that subscribe button. Let us step into Debaltum. The year 376 AD saw the kind of desperation that births wars no one can stop. Beyond the Danube River, the northern frontier of the Roman Empire, An entire civilization was running for its lives. Not a raiding party, not a war band, an entire nation. The Tervingi, whom history would remember as the Visigoths, appeared on the northern banks with women, children, the elderly, livestock, wagons carrying everything they owned. Between 100,000 and 200,000 people. A migration whose scale made Roman border officials physically ill. They weren't invading. They were begging. Behind them, coming from the endless Eurasian steppe, rode the Huns. Nomadic horsemen whose composite bows could put arrows through Roman armor at ranges that made conventional warfare obsolete. Whose mobility made every battle a massacre. Whose ruthlessness had already shattered the Ostrogoths and the Alans. The Tervingi, facing annihilation, did what desperate people do. They appealed to the only power strong enough to protect them: Rome. Emperor Valens, operating from his headquarters in Antioch, was preparing for war against Persia, the Sassanid Empire. Rome's eternal rival, controlled the eastern trade routes and threatened the wealthy provinces of Syria and Mesopotamia. Valens needed every soldier, every denarius, every logistical advantage. When word reached him that 40 to 50,000 Gothic warriors stood on his doorstep asking permission to cross the Danube, he saw opportunity. The calculation was sound. The empire suffered chronic manpower shortages. Farmland across Thrace lay abandoned. The army desperately needed recruits. Here stood a ready-made solution. Gothic farmers would work the land. Gothic warriors would fill the ranks. The empire would gain population, tax revenue, and military strength without spending a single coin on recruitment. Valens granted permission, cross the Danube, settle in Thrace, become subjects of Rome. What followed was systematic administrative failure that turned refugees into rebels. The Roman officials responsible for managing the migration, regional commanders named Lupicinus and Maximus, were corrupt beyond measure. The imperial treasury had allocated funds and grain to feed the Goths until they could harvest their own crops. Lupicinus and Maximus embezzled the money. They hoarded the grain. They sold imperial supplies on the black market and watched the Gothic refugee camps descend into starvation. Ammianus Marcellinus, who chronicled these events with the bitter precision of a soldier who'd seen it all, records what happened next with disgust that bleeds through the Latin. The Roman commanders, watching Gothic children starve, offered a trade. Slave markets would pay good money for healthy barbarian children. Dog meat, even from diseased animals, had value to the desperate. The Goths traded their own children for the rotting flesh of dogs. This wasn't policy. This was cruelty that guaranteed rebellion. The breaking point came at a diplomatic banquet in the provincial capital of Marcianople. Lupicinus, attempting to decapitate Gothic leadership before the situation deteriorated further, invited the Gothic chieftains Fritigern and Alavivus to a feast. During the meal, Roman soldiers launched a botched assassination attempt. Fritigern escaped. Alavivus did not. The starving, betrayed, desperate Gothic refugees erupted into total war. They slaughtered Lupicinus's garrison outside Marcianople. They armed themselves with captured Roman weapons. They began systematic pillaging of Thrace, burning villas, slaughtering Roman civilians, and destroying everything the empire had built in the province over 3 centuries. Emperor Valens, still focused on his Persian campaign, initially treated this as a localized mutiny, provincial unrest, something the frontier garrisons could handle. He was catastrophically wrong. By 377 AD, the Gothic rebellion had evolved into an existential threat. The Goths had recruited allies. Roaming bands of Huns and Alans, seeing opportunity in Roman weakness, joined the devastation. What had started as a refugee crisis had become a full-scale barbarian invasion from within the empire's own borders. Valens finally dispatched reinforcements. Experienced legions pulled from the Armenian frontier. Generals Profuturus and Trajanus, competent commanders who understood what they faced. The forces converged in Thrace and met the Gothic horde at a place called Ad Salices, by the Willows. The battle that followed was a grinding, day-long slaughter. Roman heavy infantry against Gothic shield walls. No cavalry charges, no clever maneuvers. Just two masses of armored men hacking each other apart from dawn until dusk. When darkness finally ended the killing, neither side had won. Both had simply bled each other into exhaustion. Ammianus records that the battlefield remained white with bones for years afterward. Travelers avoided it. Locals spoke of ghosts. The Roman high command, recognizing they couldn't defeat the Goths in open battle, shifted strategy. If we can't destroy them, trap them. The Haemus Mountains, the Balkan Range running east-west across Thrace, offered narrow passes and defensible choke points. The Romans established fortified positions blocking every exit. The plan was elegant. Bottle the Goths in the mountains, cut off their food supply, watch them starve. It worked for exactly 7 days. The Goths hid in their wagon lagers, protective circles of wagons that sheltered families and supplies. They couldn't forage. They couldn't break out. They were trapped. Then they did what desperate, clever people do. They negotiated. Roaming bands of Huns and Alans, heavy cavalry with no loyalty to Rome, agreed to join the Gothic coalition. Professional warriors whose mobility could shatter static defenses. When the combined force hit the Roman blockades, they didn't just break through. They annihilated the defenders and poured into the unprotected Thracian plains like savage beasts that had broken their cages. That phrase is Ammianus's. He chose it deliberately. By late 377, the situation had deteriorated beyond containment. Gothic war bands ranged across the wealthiest provinces of the Eastern Empire, burning, looting, killing. Roman forces, scattered and demoralized, couldn't mass for decisive battle. The frontier garrisons were too weak. The field armies were too slow. Every engagement ended the same way. Romans arrived. Goths evaded or attacked. Romans bled. It was in this context of systematic failure and spreading chaos that Tribune Barzimares and the Cornuti Auxiliaries marched toward Debaltum on the Black Sea coast. They were looking for a defensive position. They found a killing ground. Picture a man whose name appears exactly once in the historical record. No birthplace, no family, no detailed biography, just a rank, a unit, and a death. Tribune Barzimares. What Ammianus Marcellinus does tell us speaks volumes. Barzimares was tribune of the Scutari, an elite imperial guard unit whose name derived from their distinctive large shields. The Scutum, these weren't ceremonial bodyguards, they were combat veterans, the emperor's personal enforcers, men who'd earned their positions through blood and competence in a military culture that had no patience for aristocratic incompetence. Ammianus describes Barzimares with a phrase that carries weight in military writing. Thoroughly trained in the dust of warfare. Not theory, not parade ground experience. Dust. The gritty, exhausting, terrifying reality of actual combat. Barzimares had commanded operations on the Persian frontier, where Roman forces faced the most sophisticated military machine in the world. The Sassanid Empire fielded heavy cavalry, combined arms tactics, and strategic depth that made Gothic war bands look like barbarian amateurs. If you survived command on the Persian frontier, you understood warfare at the highest level. The force Barzimirs commanded at Debaltum reflected the strange, hybrid nature of the late Roman military. His own Scutari formed the core, professional Roman soldiers who'd spent years in imperial service. Alongside them marched a detachment of the Cornuti, one of the most famous Auxilia Palatina units in the empire. The Auxilia Palatina represented Rome's solution to an intractable problem. How do you maintain military excellence when your own citizens refuse to serve? By the 4th century, the classical Roman citizen legionary had become extinct. The wealthy urban populations of the Mediterranean world had no interest in military service. They paid taxes. They expected professional soldiers to defend them. The rural populations, decimated by plague and economic collapse, couldn't provide enough recruits. So Rome recruited from beyond its borders. Germanic tribes, specifically, warriors from the Rhine and Danube frontiers who'd been fighting Romans for generations and understood warfare as cultural identity. The Cornuti were Franks. Their name meant the horned ones, derived from their practice of attaching animal horns to their helmets. Archaeological evidence and iconographic depictions, including carvings on the Arch of Constantine in Rome, show them as terrifying figures. Tall Germanic warriors in Roman armor, carrying Roman weapons, executing Roman tactics, but retaining elements of their ancestral war culture. They'd fought for Constantine the Great at the Battle of the Milvian Bridge in 312 AD, helping establish the dynasty that now ruled the empire. They were split into senior and junior regiments, elite shock infantry assigned to the Palatini, the highest tier of the mobile field armies. When emperors needed infantry that could break enemy lines through sheer ferocity, they deployed the Cornuti. Ammianus had seen them fight. At the Battle of Strasbourg in 357 AD, the Cornuti and their sister unit, the Bracciati, had faced an Alemannic confederation under Emperor Julian the Apostate. Before the battle, they'd executed a psychological warfare tactic called the gestus, a shield dance. 500 men moving their large oval shields in perfect unison, creating a hypnotic, terrifying visual display while chanting the brilliance. The brilliance was older than Rome, a Germanic war cry that began as a low, guttural murmur, men holding their shields close to their mouths so the sound would resonate off the wood and iron. As the tension built, the sound rose. Individual voices merged into a collective roar that grew louder and louder until it sounded like waves crashing against cliffs. Enemies who'd never heard it before broke formation. Some ran. The psychological impact was devastating, but the Cornuti weren't just theater. They were lethal. Late Roman infantry, contrary to popular myths of decline, was heavily armored and well-equipped. The classical articulated plate armor, the lorica segmentata, had been phased out. Too complex, too difficult to maintain in the field. It had been replaced by chainmail, lorica hamata, or scale armor, lorica squamata. Both offered excellent protection against slashing weapons and arrows. Both were easier to repair when damaged. Helmets had evolved too. The spongion helm, constructed from multiple iron plates riveted together along a central ridge, provided superior protection. Chainmail neck guards, solid cheek plates, Germanic in origin, adopted by Rome because it worked. Offensively, the short stabbing gladius had given way to the spada, a longer, heavier broadsword suited for both slashing and thrusting. But before swords ever clashed, Roman infantry fought as missile troops. Each soldier carried a thrusting spear, the hasta, which could be thrown. Several lead-weighted throwing darts, plumb batae, clipped behind their shields. These darts could be hurled over the front ranks with high arcing trajectories, penetrating shields and armor seconds before the infantry lines collided. They also carried heavier javelins, spicula or veruta. The tactical sequence was precise. At 50 yards, volley the plumbatae. At 30 yards, hurl the javelins. At 10 yards, draw swords and close. If executed correctly, the enemy reached your shield wall already bleeding, already disorganized, already terrified. The cornuti at Debaltum carried shields painted in distinctive patterns. The Notitia Dignitatum, an early 5th century administrative document, records these unit identifications. Twin-headed zoomorphic designs, reds and yellows and blues, bright enough to be recognized across a smoke-filled battlefield. When the cornuti formed their shield wall, everyone knew who they were. This was the force Barzimirs commanded. Professional Roman guards who'd fought Persians, elite Germanic auxiliaries who'd broken Alemanni. Men who understood that when you're caught in the open by overwhelming numbers, discipline is the only weapon that matters. They were marching toward Debaltum to establish a fortified camp, standard Roman procedure. Every night, dig trenches, raise earthworks, create a miniature fortress. It's what kept Roman armies alive in hostile territory for 1,000 years. But at Debaltum, they wouldn't have time to finish. The Gothic horde descending on Debaltum wasn't a professional army. It was a migration fighting for survival. 40,000 warriors. But that number doesn't capture the reality. Behind those warriors came families, wives, children, the elderly, wagons carrying everything they owned, livestock. The entire Gothic nation, homeless and desperate, had been rampaging across Thrace for months, taking what they needed because Rome had betrayed them. They fought with the ferocity of people who had nothing left to lose. The Gothic military system was fundamentally different from Rome's. They had no professional standing army, no formal ranks, no standardized equipment. What they had was a warrior culture where every free man was expected to fight. Boys trained from childhood. Manhood meant proving yourself in combat. Social status derived from battlefield success. Their primary weapon was the spear. Long thrusting spears, sometimes 10 feet or more. Used in tight formations, these created a hedge of iron points that could stop cavalry charges and push back infantry. Unlike Roman infantry, who used shields defensively while striking with swords, Gothic warriors fought with shield and spear in aggressive, shoving phalanx formations. They also carried swords, though quality varied wildly. Wealthy warriors owned pattern-welded blades, sophisticated weapons created by molding and forging different grades of iron and steel to create strong, flexible swords. Poor warriors carried cruder blades, sometimes little more than sharpened iron bars. Armor was scarce. Only the wealthiest Gothic nobles could afford chainmail. Most warriors fought in leather or thick wool tunics, relying on their shields for protection. Those shields were large, often oval or circular, made from wooden planks bound together and covered with leather. A central iron boss protected the hand grip and could be used offensively. But the Goths' greatest advantage wasn't their infantry, it was their cavalry. The Gothic coalition at Debaltum included Ostrogothic and Alan heavy cavalry. The Alans, originally from the Eurasian steppe, were among the finest horsemen in the world. They fought as shock cavalry, using long lances called contos to punch through infantry formations. Their horses were larger and stronger than typical Roman mounts, bred specifically for the weight of an armored rider delivering maximum impact. This cavalry would prove decisive at Debaltum, not because Gothic tactics were superior to Roman tactics, but because cavalry can do something infantry cannot. They can encircle. The Goths had learned Roman weakness through brutal experience. At Ad Salices, they'd fought Roman infantry to a standstill. In the mountain passes, They'd been trapped until Hun and Allan cavalry broke the blockade. They understood that Roman infantry, properly deployed with adequate reserves and cavalry screening, was nearly unbeatable in frontal combat. But if you could flank them, if you could get around the sides or behind them, if you could force them to fight in multiple directions simultaneously. They broke, not through cowardice, through mathematics. You can only defend so many angles before the shield wall has gaps. The Gothic force that discovered Barzimir's pitching camp at Debaltum had been foraging, searching for food, loot, anything valuable. They stumbled onto a Roman force in the worst possible tactical position, scattered, tools in hand, defensive works incomplete. For the Goths, it was an opportunity they couldn't pass up. Destroy a Roman force, capture supplies, send a message to Valens that his soldiers were dying in forgotten places while he prepared for a glory campaign against fellow Romans or Persians. For Barzimirs, it was the nightmare every Roman commander feared. Caught in the open. No walls, no prepared positions. Enemy cavalry already visible. He had seconds to decide. Run and get cut down from behind by cavalry. Or fight. He chose to fight. There's a moment in every impossible situation where panic and calculation collide, where training either holds or shatters, where commanders either freeze or act. Barzimirs acted. Ammianus Marcellinus records the sequence with the clinical precision of a man who'd been in similar situations. As the exigency of imminent destruction compelled him, he ordered the trumpet to sound the attack. That sentence contains everything. Not the trumpet for retreat, not for defensive positions, for attack. To understand why, you need to understand what Barzimirs saw. Gothic warriors pouring over the horizon. Dust clouds indicating massive numbers. Cavalry flankers moving to encircle. His own men scattered across a partially completed camp, entrenching tools in hand, armor loosened, formations non-existent. If he ordered retreat, what happened? The men ran. Gothic cavalry, faster than infantry, rode them down from behind. Fleeing soldiers can't maintain formation, can't defend each other. They die individually, cut down one by one until none survive. Cavalry slaughter of routing infantry is the most one-sided killing in warfare. There would be no survivors. If he ordered defensive positions within the incomplete camp, what happened? The men tried to shelter behind half-dug trenches and partial earthworks. Gothic infantry, massively superior in numbers, simply overwhelmed the position. The cavalry encircled and prevented escape. Same result. Annihilation. Slower, but certain. If he ordered attack, what happened? The men formed ranks. They advanced as a unit. They disrupted Gothic momentum before the enemy could fully deploy. They forced the Goths to fight the kind of disciplined frontal infantry battle where Roman training gave them temporary advantage. They would still lose. The numbers were too extreme. But they might last longer. They might inflict enough casualties to matter. They might give some men a chance to escape when the line finally broke. Barzimirs chose the option that gave his men the best chance of dying well. The trumpet sounded. Not a gentle call. A harsh, braying blast that cut through panic and imposed order through sound alone. Roman soldiers were conditioned from recruitment to respond to trumpet calls without thought. The sound bypassed conscious decision and triggered muscle memory. Drop the tools. Grab your weapons. Form ranks. Ammianus records that Barzimirs instantly protected his flanks and drew up his lines in very close formation. The specific Latin phrasing indicates this wasn't a loose skirmish formation. This was the testudo variation of the shield wall. Dense, tight, shields overlapping. Front rank kneeling with shields planted, second rank standing with shields raised. third rank ready to step forward when the front rank tired. The flanks, the most vulnerable part of any infantry formation, were refused. Angled back slightly so that any cavalry trying to wrap around would face a continuous shield wall rather than an exposed side. This wasn't improvisation. This was textbook Roman infantry doctrine, executed under conditions that should have made textbook doctrine impossible. But forming the shield wall was only the first step. Barzimirs did something that reveals either genius or desperation. He led from the front. Roman military tradition was complex on this point. Generals were expected to share their soldiers' dangers, but not foolishly. A dead general meant command collapse. But Barzimirs wasn't thinking about preserving command structure for a battle he might win. He was thinking about morale for a battle he would lose. Men fight harder when their commander stands in the front rank. When he faces the same arrows, the same swords, the same terror, cowards don't follow. They run. But men who see their general in the killing zone, they hold. Barzimirs positioned himself at the head of his formation and ordered the advance. Not a cautious movement, a charge. Running infantry, shields locked, roaring the Berytus war cry. The cornuti knew how to make that sound. 500 Germanic throats, creating the noise that had terrified Romans for centuries, now turned against Goths. The psychological impact was immediate. The Goths, expecting to slaughter scattered Romans, instead faced a disciplined wall of shields advancing at speed, screaming like demons. It disrupted their momentum, not permanently, not decisively. But for crucial seconds, the Gothic advance faltered. Warriors hesitated, looked to their chieftains for orders, tried to form their own shield walls to receive the Roman charge. In those seconds, Barzimirs achieved what he needed. He turned chaos into combat on terms that favored training over numbers. For a little while, the two shield walls collided with the sound of thunder. Wood on wood, iron on iron. The impact physically drove men backward. Front ranks crashed together, shields interlocking, spears and swords seeking gaps. And then, the real killing began. There's a reason ancient historians rarely describe the interior experience of infantry combat. It's nearly indescribable. Modern readers imagine sword fights as individual duels, extended exchanges, parries and ripostes, dramatic confrontations between named warriors. Ancient shield wall combat was nothing like that. You stood shoulder to shoulder with the men beside you, so close you could smell their fear, feel their breath. The front rank held shields locked together, creating a wooden wall. Behind them, the second rank pressed forward, adding weight, preventing the front rank from being pushed back. You couldn't see more than a few feet in any direction. Dust from thousands of stamping feet rose like fog. Blood mist from opened arteries. The iron smell so thick you tasted it. The noise was inhuman. Thousands of men screaming, swords hammering shields, spear shafts breaking, the wounded howling, the dying begging. All of it amplified in the compression of bodies until sound itself became a weapon that degraded rational thought. You didn't fight individuals. You fought the mass in front of you, stabbing at anything that moved, shoving with your shield, trying to create space to swing your sword, knowing that if you fell, you'd be trampled by your own side before the enemy ever reached you. The Cornuti and Scutari at Debaltum fought this kind of battle. Ammianus records specific details that reveal the intensity. Javelins and missile weapons did not cease. Even in close combat, men in the rear ranks continued throwing. Plumbatae arcing over the front lines, javelins hurled at 10-foot range. Some struck shields, some struck helmets and glanced off. Some found gaps in armor and punched through chainmail into flesh. A man in the front rank might stand and fight for 5 to 10 minutes before exhaustion forced him back, swinging a 3-pound sword while wearing 40 pounds of armor and equipment, while being shoved from behind and pushed from in front, while adrenaline and terror burned through your muscles. You couldn't sustain it. When the front rank tired, the second rank stepped through gaps in the shield wall, and the exhausted warriors rotated to the rear to catch their breath. This rotation was the key to Roman infantry endurance. Fresh fighters constantly replacing tired ones. The line never weakened, but it only worked if you had enough depth, enough reserves to maintain the rotation. At Debaltum, Barzimirs had perhaps 500 men total. Against 40,000 Goths, that meant his shield wall was outnumbered 80 to 1. The mathematics were clear. He could maintain his front line. He could rotate fighters. He could execute perfect Roman infantry tactics. And eventually, inevitably, the sheer weight of Gothic numbers would grind him down. But for hours, the line held. Ammianus uses a specific phrase that Roman military historians recognize. Barzimirs mounted such a valiant resistance he would have withdrawn on equal terms. That's not rhetoric. That's technical assessment. The Roman infantry fought so effectively that had the numbers been even remotely equal, they would have forced the Goths to disengage. But numbers weren't equal. Think about what that means. 500 men holding against thousands, not through walls or fortifications, through discipline alone, through training that made every movement automatic, through unit cohesion so strong that men didn't break, even when they knew that they were dying. The Cornuti executed their shield dance one final time, not before the battle, during it. In lulls, when both sides pulled back to reorganize, the Germanic auxiliaries moved their shields in unison. The gestus, the hypnotic pattern that said, "We are still here. We have not broken. Come and die." And the Goths came, wave after wave, fresh warriors rotating forward while the Romans had no reserves. The Gothic chieftains could afford to spend men. They had 40,000. Losing 100 meant nothing. Losing 1,000 meant nothing. They could trade bodies until the Roman line physically could not continue. Inside that shrinking perimeter, men fought past exhaustion into something beyond human endurance. Sword arms went numb. Shields felt like they weighed hundreds of pounds. Breathing became agony. Thirst burned like fire, and still they held. Because breaking meant dying alone. Holding meant dying together. The Roman military culture had spent centuries refining the psychology of unit cohesion. From recruitment, soldiers were taught that the man beside you mattered more than yourself, that the unit was your family, that Roman infantry did not run. At Debaltum, that indoctrination held past the point where rational calculation said it should fail. But indoctrination cannot overcome mathematics forever. The Goths weren't stupid. They could see the Roman line holding. They could see their own casualties mounting. Infantry against infantry, training and equipment gave Rome the edge even when outnumbered. So the Gothic chieftains did what intelligent commanders do when frontal assault fails. They sent in the cavalry. The thing about fighting in a shield wall is that your field of vision collapses to whatever is directly in front of you. The man you're trying to kill. The shield you're trying to break. The spear point you're trying to avoid. You don't see the flanks. You don't see the rear. You trust that other men are holding those positions. You focus on your sector and trust the system. At Debaltum, that trust was about to be betrayed by mathematics. Ammianus doesn't specify the exact timing. Ancient historians rarely include precise hour-by-hour breakdowns. But the sequence is clear. The Roman infantry held the Gothic infantry advance. The battle became a grinding stalemate. The Romans, despite catastrophic numerical inferiority, inflicted casualties and maintained formation. Then, a massive force of cavalry appeared. Not Gothic cavalry stumbling into the fight. A deliberate, coordinated flanking maneuver, Ostrogothic and Allan heavy cavalry, the finest horsemen available to the Gothic coalition, riding in formation to execute a textbook encirclement. The Romans saw them coming. You can't hide several hundred horsemen. The dust alone would be visible for miles. But seeing them and stopping them are different things. Infantry and shield wall formation cannot effectively respond to cavalry flanking attacks. You're locked in place, engaged frontally, unable to wheel and face a new direction without breaking contact with the enemy in front of you. If you turn to face the cavalry, the infantry you were fighting breaks through your front. If you hold against the infantry, the cavalry hits your flank unopposed. It's not a tactical problem with a solution. It's a tactical problem that ends in annihilation. Barzimirs would have known this. Every Roman officer was taught the famous disasters. Cannae, where Hannibal's cavalry encircled 8 Roman legions and slaughtered them. Carrhae, where Parthian cavalry destroyed Crassus's army. Encirclement meant death. The Gothic cavalry swept around both flanks simultaneously. They weren't charging into the shield wall. They were completing the circle, cutting off escape routes, creating a pocket. Inside that pocket, 500 Roman soldiers who'd been fighting for hours, who were already exhausted, who'd already performed miracles of discipline and courage, now faced the mathematical certainty of their own destruction. Ammianus records what happened with brutal honesty. The Romans, spent and breathless, could no longer maintain their resistance. That phrase captures everything. Spent, not cowards, not broken by fear. Spent, used up, every muscle screaming, every breath painful. Swords too heavy to lift, shields dragging at arms that couldn't hold them level anymore. The human body has limits. You can push past them temporarily through adrenaline and willpower. But eventually, the muscles simply stop responding. You want to fight. Your brain sends the signals. Your body ignores them. The Roman shield wall, which had held for hours against impossible odds, began to compress. Not a rout, not panic, just slow, inevitable physical collapse. The Goths pushed from the front. The cavalry squeezed from the flanks and rear. The pocket shrank. Men who'd been fighting with room to swing swords found themselves pressed so tightly they couldn't move their arms. Shields overlapped. Bodies crushed together. In that compression, fighting became impossible. You couldn't retreat, couldn't advance, couldn't even fall down when wounded because the press of bodies held you upright. The massacre shifted from combat to slaughter. Gothic spears stabbed into the packed mass. Swords found gaps. Men died without seeing who killed them. Some were trampled. Some suffocated in the crush of bodies. Some were wounded and bled out while still standing, held in place by the corpses around them. Barzimirs, leading from the front, would have been in the densest part of the fighting. Ammianus records only that he fell fighting valiantly. No dramatic last words, no heroic sacrifice that turned the tide. Just death in the press. One more body in the pile. The commander who'd ordered the trumpet to sound attack, who'd led the charge that disrupted Gothic momentum, who'd bought his men hours they shouldn't have had. He died anonymously in a killing pocket that consumed everyone who entered it. The Cornuti, the elite Germanic auxiliaries who'd broken Alemanni at Strasbourg and helped Constantine win an empire, disappeared into the same slaughter. Their distinctive painted shields shattered, their Berytus war cry silenced, their unit cohesion dissolved in blood and exhaustion. Ammianus sums up the battle with the economy that defines military writing. The engagement was disastrous to the Romans. 500 men, an experienced general, an elite auxiliary regiment, all destroyed, gone. For the Gothic coalition, it was a tactical victory that changed nothing. They'd lost hundreds of their own warriors. They'd expended time and energy destroying a force that wasn't strategically significant. Barzimirs commanded a single small detachment, not an army that could threaten the entire Gothic migration. For Rome, it was one more in an endless series of bleeding cuts. 500 trained soldiers couldn't be easily replaced. Barzimirs himself, with his Persian frontier experience, represented institutional knowledge that died with him. The Cornuti would need to recruit and train replacements, assuming the unit maintained enough cohesion to continue existing. But in the larger strategic picture, Dibaltum was a footnote, a forgotten massacre on the road to greater catastrophes. The survivors, if any escaped the cavalry pursuit, would have staggered back toward other Roman forces, carrying news of another defeat, another force destroyed, another commander dead. The empire was bleeding in 100 places. Dibaltum was just one more wound. Here's the strange thing about military history. The battles we remember aren't always the most tactically significant. They're the ones that carried symbolic weight, that represented turning points, that featured famous names or changed empires. Dibaltum had none of that. Barzimirs wasn't a famous general. The Cornuti, despite their elite status, weren't household names. The battle itself didn't change the strategic situation. The Goths continued rampaging across Thrace. The Romans continued bleeding, so history forgot. When people discuss the Gothic War, they mention Ad Salices, the grinding draw that killed thousands. They obsess over Adrianople, where Emperor Valens died and 2/3 of the Eastern Roman field army was annihilated. Those battles made the history books. Those battles defined the war. Dibaltum appears in Ammianus Marcellinus' account as a single paragraph, a brief mention between larger events. The historian notes Barzimirs' experience, the fact that he was caught pitching camp, the valiant resistance, the cavalry envelopment, the annihilation. Then he moves on. That's all we have. One paragraph in one source. No archaeological evidence has been discovered at Dibaltum linking to this specific battle. The modern city of Burgas, Bulgaria, sits on the ancient site. Centuries of continuous habitation have buried or destroyed whatever physical traces the battle might have left. We don't know where exactly the Romans were pitching camp. We don't know the precise location of the Gothic approach. We don't know where the cavalry envelopment occurred. We don't even know how many Goths died in the grinding infantry combat before the encirclement. What we know is what Ammianus chose to preserve: a commander's name, a unit's identity, the tactical sequence, the outcome. And perhaps that's enough, because Dibaltum represents something more important than tactical innovation or strategic brilliance. It represents the reality of late Roman warfare that popular imagination ignores. The empire didn't fall in a single dramatic collapse. It bled to death through 1,000 Dibaltums. Competent commanders destroyed leading understrength units in forgotten places. Elite troops ground down in battles that changed nothing. Experience and training eroded in wars that had no winners, only varying degrees of losers. The Cornuti at Dibaltum fought as well as any Roman infantry in history. They executed shield wall tactics that would have made the legions of Caesar proud. They held discipline under conditions that should have caused immediate rout. They died doing what they were trained to do. And it didn't matter. Not because they failed, but because the empire was failing. Because the system that recruited, trained, equipped, and deployed them was running out of time, money, and men. Because every battle, win or lose, depleted irreplaceable resources. The Gothic War revealed the fundamental unsustainability of the late Roman military model. The empire needed constant warfare to maintain its borders. But constant warfare consumed the very populations and economies that made warfare possible. It was a death spiral dressed as strategic necessity. Gibraltar was a microcosm. 500 highly trained soldiers, months or years of training, expensive equipment, institutional knowledge, all consumed in hours to delay a Gothic force that would simply move on to pillage elsewhere. The mathematics didn't work. They couldn't work. And a year later, at Adrianople, the entire system collapsed. The destruction of Barzimires sent ripples that Rome ignored. By spring 378 AD, Emperor Valens had finally concluded a hasty, unsatisfying peace with Persia and transferred his main field army from the eastern frontier to Constantinople. His nephew, the Western Roman Emperor Gratian, was marching eastward with reinforcements from Gaul, having just secured a major victory against the Lentienses at Argentovaria. Valens appointed a new commander to his eastern forces, Sebastianus, a capable and innovative general who understood that the slow-moving Roman field army couldn't catch mobile Gothic foraging bands. Sebastianus instituted a radical tactical shift. Instead of massing for set-piece battles, he handpicked exactly 300 of the finest soldiers from each unit under his command. Elite strike forces, highly mobile, operating primarily at night. These 300-man detachments waged a guerrilla campaign against Gothic logistics. They ambushed foraging parties, reclaimed stolen supplies, slaughtered isolated barbarian bands. The psychological impact was devastating. The Goths, who'd been operating with impunity across Thrace, suddenly faced lethal opposition everywhere. Sebastianus's success inflated imperial confidence. Valens, watching his innovative general achieve what conventional tactics had failed to accomplish, began to believe the Gothic threat was manageable, beatable, perhaps even easy. Then his scouts located the main Gothic encampment, 8 to 15 miles from the city of Adrianople. The scouts reported Gothic strength at approximately 10,000 warriors. This intelligence was catastrophically wrong. The scouts had observed the Gothic infantry protecting the wagon laager. They'd missed the massive Gothic and Allan cavalry force, perhaps 5 to 10,000 horsemen that was miles away foraging for supplies. Valens, jealous of his nephew Gratian's recent military successes and desperate to claim sole glory for defeating the Goths, ignored the council of senior officers. Ricomers, his Magister Officiorum, pleaded with him to wait for the Western reinforcements. Prudent commanders advised delay. Valens refused. He commanded perhaps 15 to 30,000 men. Against what he believed was 10,000 Goths, he held overwhelming numerical superiority. Why share the victory? Why let Gratian claim credit? On the morning of August 9th, 378 AD, Valens marched his army out of Adrianople, leaving his imperial treasury and baggage train safely within the city walls. He would never return. The Roman army marched 8 miles over rough terrain under the August sun, dehydrated, exhausted, carrying 60 pounds of armor and equipment. They arrived at the Gothic position in early afternoon. The Goths had arranged their wagons in a massive circular fortification, the laager. Families and non-combatants sheltered inside. The warriors stood ready to defend. Fritigern, the Gothic chieftain, saw that his cavalry was absent and immediately engaged in protracted peace negotiations. This was pure stalling, buying time for messengers to recall the foraging cavalry. While negotiations dragged on, the Goths lit massive brush fires upwind of the Roman positions, choking the waiting infantry with smoke and heat. Roman discipline collapsed from the bottom up. Skirmishers, the Scutari and Sagittarii, impatient and eager for combat, launched an uncoordinated attack against the wagon lager without orders. Fighting uphill against fortified positions, they were easily repulsed. Their bloody retreat created confusion in the advancing Roman heavy infantry. At that precise moment, with the Roman center disorganized and engaged against the wagons, the Gothic and Alan cavalry arrived. Ammianus describes them descending like a thunderbolt from the surrounding hills. The barbarian heavy cavalry struck the Roman right wing, which was still deploying into formation, and shattered it completely. They swept around both flanks, executing a perfect double envelopment. The Roman infantry found itself trapped between the wagon lager on one side and cavalry pressure on all others. The compression was lethal, packed so tightly that soldiers couldn't draw their swords, couldn't lift their shields, couldn't even fall when wounded. Men suffocated, were trampled, were stabbed by spears they never saw. Dust and smoke reduced visibility to feet. The roar of battle drowned out all commands. Command structure disintegrated. Emperor Valens, recognizing the catastrophe, called for his strategic reserves. Specifically, he ordered his general Victor to bring up the Batavi regiment. The Batavi, elite Auxilia Palatina, held in reserve for exactly this kind of emergency. Germanic shock troops with a reputation for ferocity and discipline. The force that should have stabilized the collapsing line. Victor rode to the reserve position and found it empty. The Batavi had fled, watching the systematic destruction of the Roman center. They'd broken formation and abandoned the field. The reserves that should have saved the emperor were gone. Victor, realizing the battle was lost and no help was coming, also fled. The actual last stand at Adrianople was made by two heavy infantry legions, the Lanciari and the Mattiari. These veterans refused to break. They maintained their shield wall amidst the slaughter. Emperor Valens, abandoned by his cavalry and reserves, dismounted and sought refuge within their protective ring. He died there, either struck by an arrow or wounded and carried to a nearby farmhouse that was subsequently burned by Goths who didn't know the Emperor of Rome was inside. By sunset, 2/3 of the Eastern Roman field army was annihilated. 10 to 20,000 highly trained soldiers, irreplaceable combat veterans, the institutional knowledge and command structure of an empire. Gone. Ammianus compared the disaster only to Cannae, where Hannibal destroyed Rome's legions in 216 BC. No higher insult existed in Roman military literature. The contrast with Debaltum is instructive. At Debaltum, 500 men led by an experienced commander executed perfect infantry tactics and died with honor. At Adrianople, 30,000 men, led by an emperor, died in chaos and panic. One battle demonstrated what Roman discipline could achieve. The other demonstrated what happened when that discipline collapsed. History remembers Adrianople because an emperor died. It forgets Debaltum, even though the tactical execution was superior. The immediate consequence of Adrianople was strategic paralysis. The Eastern Roman Empire had lost its field army. The Goths, having won the greatest victory any barbarian force had achieved against Rome in over a century, were too disorganized to exploit it. They laid siege to Adrianople but lacked siege equipment. They tried to assault Constantinople but couldn't breach the walls. The new emperor, Theodosius I, faced an impossible situation. He needed an army but had no soldiers. He needed to defeat the Goths but lacked the military strength. So he did something that previous emperors would have considered unthinkable. He negotiated. In 382 AD, Theodosius concluded a peace treaty that allowed the Goths to settle permanently in Thrace as an autonomous political entity. They would provide military service to Rome, but they would fight under their own Gothic commanders. They would not be integrated into Roman military structure. They would not be dispersed across the empire. Rome had created an armed, autonomous state within its own borders. The precedent was catastrophic. Within a generation, the Goths realized they held all the leverage. They provided the military force that defended the empire. The empire depended on them. And if the empire depended on them, they could make demands. In 410 AD, the Visigothic king Alaric, who had served as a Roman general and knew Roman tactics intimately, sacked Rome. The Eternal City, unconquered for 800 years, fell to the descendants of the warriors who fought at Adrianople. The Western Roman Empire limped on for another 66 years. But Adrianople was the moment it became inevitable. And Debultum? A forgotten skirmish, a footnote, a single paragraph in Ammianus Marcellinus that most readers skip. But perhaps that's appropriate. The empire didn't fall in dramatic moments. It fell in quiet places. Competent commanders killed leading understrength units. Elite troops ground down in battles that didn't matter. Resources consumed faster than they could be replaced. Debultum was the empire dying. We just didn't notice because we were watching Adrianople. Military historians studying Debultum focus on what Barzimirs achieved despite losing. He was caught pitching camp, the worst tactical position for an ancient army. Scattered formations, tools instead of weapons, no prepared defenses, enemy already visible. Standard doctrine said retreat or seek defensive terrain. Barzimirs rejected both. He sounded attack. The trumpet blast achieved 3 critical outcomes. First, it imposed order through sound. Soldiers conditioned to respond to trumpet calls dropped tools and grabbed weapons automatically. No time wasted on decision-making. Second, it disrupted Gothic momentum. The Goths expected to slaughter scattered Romans. Instead, they faced a disciplined charge. The psychological shock bought seconds. Third, it allowed Barzimirs to dictate engagement terms. By advancing aggressively, he forced frontal combat where Roman training and equipment provided maximum advantage. The shield wall he formed demonstrated late Roman infantry at its peak. Overlapping shields, refused flanks, continuous rotation of fresh fighters, integrated missile and melee tactics. For hours, 500 men held against thousands. The Goths couldn't break the formation through frontal assault. They needed cavalry envelopment to create the conditions for annihilation. Modern military analysis recognizes this as near-perfect tactical execution under impossible conditions. Barzimirs couldn't win. The numbers prevented it. But he could control how he lost. He could make the Goths pay for every foot of ground. He could ensure his men died as soldiers, not as scattered victims. The contrast with Adrianople is devastating. At Adrianople, Roman infantry outnumbered the Gothic infantry. Roman equipment was superior. Roman training was extensive. They should have won. They lost because command structure collapsed, because skirmishers attacked without orders, because reserves fled instead of engaging, because panic spread faster than discipline could contain it. Debultum proved that late Roman infantry, properly led, could execute tactics that rivaled the legendary legions of antiquity. Adrianople proved that leadership and morale mattered more than equipment or numbers. The tactical principles Barzimirs demonstrated remain relevant. Modern infantry in bad situations still face the same calculation. Fight and control the terms of engagement, or flee and get cut down piecemeal. The specific technologies change, the mathematics don't. Ancient sources rarely record the names of common soldiers. We know generals, emperors, occasionally centurions or tribunes, The soldiers who actually fought and died? Anonymous. The Cornuti at Debaltum, 500 Germanic warriors fighting for Rome. We don't know where they were recruited, don't know their ages, don't know if they were veterans of multiple campaigns or recent recruits. We know they wore distinctive painted shields, knew they performed the Brilliance war cry, know they executed shield wall tactics with discipline that held against impossible odds. And we know they died, all of them. No survivors mentioned, no scattered remnants. The unit was destroyed. Think about what that means in human terms. 500 men who woke up that morning expecting a routine day. Pitch camp, establish defenses, rest, prepare for tomorrow's march. Instead, they spent their last hours in the most brutal close combat ancient warfare could produce. Exhausted, terrified, knowing they would lose, holding anyway. Some died quickly, spear through the throat, sword through the chest, instant or near-instant death. Some died slowly, gut wounds that took hours, bleeding that couldn't be stopped, thirst that burned while they lay dying in the sun. Some died in the final compression, suffocated in the press of bodies, trampled, crushed. Each one was someone's son. Some were fathers, husbands, brothers, men with families who would receive news of death weeks or months later. If they received news at all. The Goths who killed them went home, to wives and children, to rebuild their lives in the Roman provinces they'd been granted. Some probably told stories about the battle, about the Romans who wouldn't break, about the shield wall that held until cavalry forced the end. But they didn't know the names either. History preserves tactics. It forgets people. We remember that the Cornuti made a last stand. We forget that the Cornuti were 500 individuals who died afraid and in pain. This is the cost of empire, not the glorious sacrifices of legend. The grinding, anonymous death of competent soldiers in forgotten places. 500 names we'll never know. 500 lives that ended because administrative corruption turned refugees into rebels. Because emperors chose glory over prudence. Because the machinery of empire consumed people faster than it could replace them. They deserved better. They deserved to be remembered. Instead, they got a paragraph in Ammianus Marcellinus and 15 centuries of silence. The premise that started this investigation claimed 300 Romans held a bridge against 40,000 Goths, leaving only 7 survivors. The last stand of the Batavi and Cornuti at Adrianople. Every element of that sentence is wrong. Not 300, 500. Sebastianus's strike forces numbered 300 per detachment, but they were guerrilla units, not defenders of a fixed position. Not a bridge. The Batavi and Cornuti were famous for crossing rivers without bridges, swimming in armor, or using shields as boats. But Debaltum involved no river crossing, not 40,000 attacking one position. 40,000 was the total Gothic combat strength. A fraction of that force destroyed Barzimirs, not 7 survivors. That's symbolic. Ancient sources often used 7 to represent extreme rarity or divine significance, not a literal casualty count. Not the Batavi. They fled at Adrianople, never engaged. Not Adrianople. Debaltum, a year earlier, a different battle entirely. But here's what's true. Elite Roman auxiliary infantry made a last stand against overwhelming Gothic forces. They were caught in the worst possible tactical position. They formed shield wall and attacked anyway. They held for hours. They were destroyed by cavalry envelopment. Their commander died fighting at the front. The core is factual. The details are composite myth. This happens constantly in historical memory. Dramatic elements from multiple events merge into single narratives. 300 Spartans at Thermopylae become the template for every desperate stand. Bridge defenses, from Horatius Cockles to countless forgotten skirmishes, blur together. The Batavi get credit for heroism because they were famous. Because people remember famous unit names. The actual heroism of the Cornuti at Debaltum gets forgotten because Debaltum itself was forgotten. For storytelling, this creates problems. If you want historical accuracy, you need to acknowledge that the popular version is wrong. If you want dramatic impact, the popular version works better. Bridge defense is visually simple. 7 survivors is powerfully symbolic. 300 is the perfect number for intimacy and desperation. But accuracy and impact aren't mutually exclusive. The truth of Debaltum is more compelling than the myth. A commander who orders attack when retreat is impossible. Infantry who execute perfect tactics, knowing they'll die anyway. The Baritis war cry from men who'd been enemies of Rome a generation earlier, now dying for the empire. That's drama. That's human truth. That's history worth preserving. The myth is memorable. The reality is meaningful. We should choose meaning. Debaltum seems insignificant in the vast sweep of Roman history. 500 men, 1 forgotten battle, no strategic impact. Why dedicate this much analysis to a footnote? Because Debaltum represents the fundamental tension at the heart of the late Roman Empire. The gap between military excellence and systemic failure. The Roman military machine of the 4th century was sophisticated beyond modern appreciation. Combined arms doctrine, professional career soldiers, standardized equipment and training, supply chains that could move armies across continents, fortification networks that turned entire frontiers into defensive systems. Individual Roman units, like the Cornuti at Debaltum, could execute tactics that rivaled anything in military history. Shield wall discipline, coordinated missile and melee combat, refusing flanks, fighting withdrawals, they were superb. But the system that created these units was collapsing. The tax base couldn't support the military costs. The population couldn't provide enough recruits. The political structure generated civil wars that consumed armies in internal conflicts. The strategic situation required defending too many borders against too many enemies simultaneously. Debaltum demonstrates the tragedy. You can have the best trained, best equipped, most disciplined soldiers in the world. If the empire can't afford to field enough of them, they die in scattered forces at forgotten battles. This is the lesson every empire eventually learns. Military excellence at the tactical level cannot compensate for strategic exhaustion at the systemic level. Rome's soldiers didn't fail Rome. Rome failed its soldiers. The Cornuti at Debaltum did everything right. They followed doctrine. They maintained discipline. They fought brilliantly. They died heroically. And it accomplished nothing because the rot was deeper than any battlefield could reach. This is why military historians study Debaltum despite its obscurity, because it encapsulates the paradox of late antiquity. Tactical sophistication existing alongside strategic incoherence. Individual excellence within institutional collapse. Modern militaries face similar tensions. Advanced technology and training operating within strained budgets and overstretched commitments. The specifics change. The pattern endures. Debaltum matters because it's the battle that should have been preventable. If Rome had managed the Gothic migration competently, if administrators hadn't been corrupt, if emperors had prioritized stability over glory, if 500 men died because an empire couldn't solve problems that had nothing to do with military capability. That's not ancient history. That's every empire's future. Every historical analysis rests on sources. For Debaltum, we have exactly one detailed account. Ammianus Marcellinus, Res Gestae, Book 31. Ammianus was a soldier, Greek-speaking, probably from Antioch, who served in the Roman army during the mid-4th century. He campaigned under Emperor Julian against the Persians. He witnessed battles, sieges, military disasters. He understood warfare from lived experience, not theoretical study. After retiring from active service, Ammianus wrote a comprehensive history of Rome covering the years 96 AD to 378 AD. Only the final 18 books survive, covering 353 to 378. The rest is lost. His account of the Gothic War is the most detailed contemporary source we have. He names commanders, describes tactical sequences, records casualty estimates, provides geographical context. His descriptions of battles, while occasionally employing literary conventions, contain verifiable details that modern archaeology has confirmed. For Debaltum specifically, Ammianus provides Tribune Barzimares' name and unit, confirms he was experienced in Persian frontier warfare, describes him being caught pitching camp, records the trumpet signal to attack, notes the valiant resistance, mentions the cavalry envelopment, states he died fighting. That's all we have. One paragraph in one source. No archaeological evidence has been discovered. The modern city of Burgas sits on ancient Debaltum. Centuries of continuous habitation buried whatever physical remains the battle might have left. No Gothic sources survive from this period. Barbarian societies transmitted history orally. The Goths who fought at Debaltum left no written accounts. No Byzantine histories add details. Later chroniclers who mention the Gothic War focus on Adrianople. Debaltum doesn't appear. This creates interpretive challenges. Single-source battles are vulnerable to historical skepticism. Could Ammianus have invented or exaggerated? Could details be corrupted through manuscript transmission? Could the entire event be literary fiction? Scholarly consensus accepts the basic historicity. Ammianus names a specific Roman official, Barzimares, tribune of the Scutarii. That's too specific for invention. He places the battle at Debaltum, a known location. He describes tactical sequences that match known Roman doctrine. He admits Roman defeat without embellishment or excuse. These factors suggest reliability. Invented battles in ancient histories are usually victories. Real disasters get reported with embarrassed brevity. Debaltum's very obscurity argues for authenticity. If you're inventing battles, you invent important ones. Forgotten disasters that changed nothing are exactly what gets preserved because it happened, not because it mattered. The challenge for historical reconstruction is acknowledging what we don't know. We don't know precise numbers, don't know exact location within the region, don't know how long the battle lasted, don't know Gothic casualties, don't know if any Romans escaped. We know the framework, commander, unit, tactical situation, outcome. That has to be enough. Because the alternative is forgetting entirely. And some things, even in defeat, deserve remembering. In late 377 AD, 500 Roman soldiers made a decision that defined them more than victory ever could. Caught in the worst tactical position, facing impossible odds, knowing death was certain. They formed shield wall and attacked anyway. Not because they thought they'd win. Because holding discipline in the face of annihilation was what made them Roman. The Cornuti, Germanic auxiliaries who'd adopted Roman identity so completely, they fought better than the Romans themselves. The Scutarii, elite imperial guards who'd seen every kind of horror warfare could produce. Tribune Barzimares, who'd commanded on the Persian frontier and understood exactly how this would end. They had seconds to decide. Run and die scattered, or fight and die together. The trumpet sounded. They charged. And for hours, 500 men held against thousands, not through walls or terrain, through discipline alone, through training that made exhausted arms lift shields one more time, through unit cohesion that said the man beside you matters more than yourself, through cultural conditioning so deep it functioned past the point where conscious thought failed. When the Gothic cavalry completed the encirclement, when the pocket compressed until movement became impossible, when exhaustion finally reduced combat to slaughter, the shield wall fell. Tribune Barzimares died at the front. The Cornuti disappeared into history. 500 names we'll never know. The battle changed nothing. The Goths continued their rampage. The empire continued bleeding. A year later at Adrianople, catastrophe on a scale that made Debaltum trivial would consume an emperor and an army. But for those hours at Debaltum, 500 men demonstrated what Roman military culture had spent centuries refining. The idea that discipline could transform ordinary men into something that transcended individual mortality. That unit cohesion could make the impossible become temporarily real. They couldn't rewrite mathematics. 40,000 Goths against 500 Romans had only one ending. But they could choose how they faced it. History remembers Adrianople because an emperor died. It forgets Debaltum because only soldiers died. Common men executing perfect tactics in a battle that didn't matter. That's the tragedy and the glory. Because military excellence without strategic victory is still excellence. Discipline without survival is still discipline. Courage without hope is the purest courage of all. The ruins of ancient Debaltum sit beneath modern Burgas, Bulgaria. Traffic flows, people work, life continues. The ground doesn't remember the blood it drank. But somewhere in the historical record, preserved in a single paragraph by a soldier historian who understood what he was witnessing, 500 men made their stand. Not for glory, not for empire, not for history that would forget them anyway. They held because holding was what they'd been trained to do. They fought because fighting was their identity. They died because mathematics caught up. And for a few hours in 377 AD, before the cavalry closed in, before exhaustion claimed them, before the compression made combat impossible, they proved that sometimes excellence is its own justification. Sometimes discipline trumps destiny. Sometimes 500 is enough. The battle ended. The consequences echoed. For a moment, the impossible stood. Then it was gone. But it stood.